I've always been a night owl. There's something peaceful about the world when everyone else is asleep. It's quiet, still, and allows your mind to wander freely. That's why I often took long walks around my neighborhood late at night. I live in a relatively safe area, so I never thought much about the potential dangers of wandering alone after midnight. That all changed about a year ago. It was a warm summer night. The kind where the air feels thick and heavy, but there's a cool breeze that occasionally sweeps through, making the walk more pleasant. I was strolling along the quiet streets, listening to the faint sounds of distant traffic, when I noticed something strange. Across the street, about a block ahead, I saw a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing away from me. At first glance, he seemed out of place. There was something unsettling about his posture, his stillness in a world that never truly stops moving. I kept walking, my eyes occasionally flicking back to him. As I got closer, I began to make out more details. He was tall, lanky, and wearing a suit that seemed too big for him. His arms hung awkwardly at his sides, almost as if he didn't know what to do with them. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned around. His face. I'll never forget his face. He had this wide, unnatural smile stretched across his face, like someone who had forgotten how to frown. It wasn't a kind smile, it was a grin that was far too wide for his face, stretching his features into something grotesque. His eyes, wide open and unblinking, locked onto mine. The combination of that eerie smile and those dead, vacant eyes sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, I thought he might be mentally ill or just a drunk person trying to be funny. I quickened my pace, hoping to pass him quickly and continue my walk. But then he started to move. Not in the way a normal person would. He began to walk toward me, but it was more of a slow, exaggerated dance. His legs would lift too high with each step, his arms flailing slightly as if he were mocking the act of walking. All the while, his grin remained fixed on his face, his eyes never leaving mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. Something was deeply wrong about this man. I crossed the street, putting more distance between us, but he changed direction too, following me without missing a beat. His strange, jerky movements didn't stop. He was mimicking me, mocking me. I turned away, picking up my pace, but I couldn't resist glancing back. He was closer now, and he wasn't walking anymore. He was running. But it wasn't a normal run. It was more like a twisted, cartoonish sprint, his arms flailing wildly as his legs moved unnaturally fast. And yet, his grin, that horrible grin, was still there, stretching even wider, if that was possible. I panicked. I broke into a full sprint, my mind racing with fear. I didn't care if it looked ridiculous, I just needed to get away from him. My heart pounded in my chest, my lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. But I couldn't stop. I reached the end of the block and turned sharply, darting into an alleyway. My breath was ragged, and my heart was in my throat as I pressed myself against a wall, hoping he wouldn't see me. I waited. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the distant hum of the city. I dared to peek out from my hiding spot. He was gone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe he had given up. Maybe it was all some sick joke. But then I saw it. A shadow, elongated by the streetlight, appeared at the entrance to the alley. Slowly, the man emerged from the darkness. His body twisted in that bizarre, unnatural way, his grin more monstrous than before. I bolted again, not looking back this time. I ran straight home, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands trembled as I tried to steady my breathing. I peered out the window, scanning the empty street. He was gone. For weeks after that, I refused to leave my house at night. I couldn't shake the image of that smiling face, those hollow eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, his grin growing wider and wider. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was a one-time thing, a random encounter with someone disturbed or deranged. But then, just a few nights ago, I saw him again. Standing under a street lamp outside my window. Smiling. Waiting. I've barely slept since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, the smiling man standing under the streetlight, his twisted face illuminated by the dim glow, his grin stretching impossibly wide. His presence outside my window is a constant reminder that he's still there, watching, waiting. But what does he want? Why me? A few nights after I first saw him standing outside my house, I woke up to a faint sound. It was subtle, almost like a soft scratching, but persistent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the side of the house. But as I became more alert, I realized it was coming from the front door. Someone was outside. I hesitated, my heart pounding, listening more closely. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I forced myself out of bed, my entire body trembling as I tiptoed toward the door. The house was dark, the silence unnerving. I carefully peeked through the peephole, praying that I wouldn't see what I feared. But there he was. The smiling man was standing on my porch, his face just inches from the door, his grin as wide as ever. His long, bony fingers were pressed against the door, moving slowly up and down, creating that awful scratching noise. His head was tilted slightly, his lifeless eyes staring directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was watching. I stumbled back, choking on my own breath. How had he found my house? Why was he here? And, more importantly, how was he so silent? There hadn't been a single footstep, no knock, no voice. Just him scratching and smiling. I backed away from the door, not sure what to do. My phone was on the kitchen counter, but it felt miles away. I was frozen with fear. I stood there, trembling, trying to listen for any sign that he was leaving. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. I held my breath, daring to hope he had gone away. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dead silence of the house. But then, slowly, I heard it. Tap. 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 It was coming from the living room window. I turned, my legs feeling like they were filled with concrete, barely able to move. The living room was bathed in shadows, but from where I stood, I could just make out the window. There he was. Standing outside, his face pressed up against the glass. His breath fogged the window, but I could still see that horrible grin, and those wide, unblinking eyes. He was closer now, so much closer. His hand was tapping lightly on the glass, as if to say, "Let me in." I backed away, panic setting in. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police with shaking hands. I didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? 9-1-1, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my house, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He's been following me, and now he's outside my window. Please, you have to send someone. The operator asked for my address, and I gave it to her in a rush, my eyes never leaving the window. I expected the smiling man to disappear the moment I called for help, but he didn't. He just kept standing there, his face plastered against the glass, that sick grin never fading. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but that brought little comfort. In the time it would take them to arrive, who knew what he could do? I couldn't take my eyes off him, terrified that if I looked away, he would vanish only to reappear even closer. Minutes dragged on like hours, the tapping on the window relentless. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. But that's when something happened that I will never forget. As soon as the sirens grew closer, the smiling man turned his head slowly to the side. His smile remained, but his eyes shifted away from me, looking down the street as if he could hear the approaching police. Then, with one final, exaggerated tap on the window, he turned and began walking away. No, not walking. Dancing. He moved in that same bizarre, jerky motion I had seen the first night, his legs lifting too high with each step, arms flailing awkwardly. And that grin, it never wavered, never faltered. I watched in horrified disbelief as he disappeared into the shadows, just as the police arrived. 2 officers knocked on my door, and I let them in, still shaking. I told them everything, showed them where the smiling man had stood, where he had tapped on the window. They searched the area, but of course, they found nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there. The police left, advising me to call again if anything else happened. But I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was imagining things, maybe having a nervous breakdown. But I know what I saw. And I know he is still out there. Because last night, just before I went to bed, I found something on my porch. A single note, written in elegant, looping handwriting: I like watching you. I'll be back soon. Keep smiling. It's been 2 weeks since I found the note on my porch, and I haven't slept properly since. Every night, I expect him to return. I keep the lights on, the doors locked, and my phone within arm's reach. But no matter how vigilant I am, I feel his presence creeping closer. I'm not sure how much longer I can take it. The police didn't help much after the first visit. When I showed them the note, they treated it like a childish prank, something easily dismissed. But it wasn't just the note, it was the feeling of being watched. I catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, shadows shifting just outside my windows. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Until last night. It was late, around 3 a.m., when I woke up to a noise I hadn't heard before. It wasn't the familiar tapping or scratching. It was something else, a soft, rhythmic humming. It sounded like a lullaby, the kind you'd sing to a child. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there, my heart pounding, I realized the sound was coming from just outside my window. I wanted to ignore it, pretend it wasn't real. But the fear gnawed at me, growing stronger with every second that passed. Slowly, I sat up in bed, my body stiff with terror, and looked toward the window. My blood turned to ice. There, standing just outside the window, was the smiling man. His face was barely visible in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his unnaturally wide grin. His mouth was moving in a slow, exaggerated manner, humming that eerie lullaby. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at me, as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. For a moment, I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The only sound in the room was the soft hum coming from his lips, a melody so wrong, it felt like it was pulling the air out of the room. Then, As if sensing my terror, he raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at me. I couldn't breathe. My throat felt tight, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't make a sound. He just stood there, humming, pointing at me with that twisted smile. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the humming stopped. His lips parted, and in a voice that sounded far too normal, too human, he whispered, "I told you I'd be back." I scrambled out of bed, my legs barely carrying me as I bolted for the door. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house, but I couldn't run either. He was outside, and there was no telling what he would do next. The sound of tapping echoed through the house again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. My heart raced as I realized he had moved. He was no longer at the window. He was right outside, waiting for me. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. As I pressed the phone to my ear, I could hear the tapping growing faster, more urgent. I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the doorknob, half expecting it to start turning at any moment. 9-1-1, what's your emergency? He's back. I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own panic. The smiling man, he's at my door. Please, you have to come now. I could hear the operator's calm voice trying to reassure me, telling me that officers were on their way, but I wasn't listening anymore. The tapping had stopped. Suddenly, there was silence again. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see him there, but it was empty. I listened, straining to hear any sign of movement, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then, from the other side of the house, I heard a faint creak, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. My blood ran cold. I never left the doors unlocked. I was sure I had checked them, double-checked them. But somehow, one of them was open. I could feel it. He was inside the house. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to think, trying to make sense of what was happening. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating. I crept slowly toward the living room, my footsteps almost soundless against the floor, listening for any hint of movement. And then, I heard it, a soft chuckle, low and sinister, coming from the darkness. "Why are you hiding?" His voice was soft, playful, as if this were all just a game. "Don't you like my smile?" I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out, but the front door felt miles away, and I knew he was somewhere in the house with me. Every shadow, every corner felt like it was hiding him, that terrible grin waiting to appear. The only place I could think to go was the bathroom. I darted toward it, locking the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 9-1-1 again. They're coming, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But I knew it would be too late. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard him. Tap. 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 His voice followed, low and dripping with malice. "I can see you." I pressed my back against the bathroom wall, clutching my phone tightly, praying that the police would arrive in time. But deep down, I knew there was nothing they could do. The smiling man wasn't just some stalker or deranged person. He was something else. Something worse. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, ever so softly, I heard the sound of his breath right next to me. And then, just before I blacked out from fear, I heard him whisper, "Keep smiling."